Hello, my name is Joey Shrager, and I will be discussing the management of the Phragmites Australis in the Raritan Basin. The invasive Phragmites were brought over from Europe in the late 18th or early 19th centuries, most likely from seeds becoming attached to a ship's bulkhead. In those 200 years, the Phragmites quickly spread across the continent and is currently found in 48 states. They are extremely common among the Atlantic coast. There is a native variety of Phragmites that is common in North America. It's found in New England marshes and it is extremely rare and non-invasive. My presentation refers to the invasive variety of Phragmites, and I would like to mention that there is a native variety indeed as well. Typically, the ecosystem impacts associated with the Phragmites australis are extremely negative. This reed is highly aggressive. They can change marsh hydrology, decrease salinity in brackish waters, change local topography, increase fire potential, and it outcompetes native plants. In fact, they're typically known for outcompeting native plants, which is where most of the roots of the problems associated with the Phragmites come from. Due to them outcompeting those native plant species, some native animal species have experienced habitat reduction. Shorebirds typically use the native plant species when migrating. Additionally, freshwater turtle nests are negatively impacted by the Phragmites. They alter the microenvironment of the nest, which threaten the reproductive success of the turtles. And Phragmites are also extremely difficult to manage. Their root systems are about 3 feet deep and are incredibly strong, making them impossible to pull up. They also reproduce at an extremely fast rate. Millions of dollars has been spent trying to manage them to very little success. A reason why they reproduce so quickly is that they use both advantages of sexual and asexual reproduction. They use sexual reproduction, their seeds, to disperse themselves over long distances. Asexually, they are clonal plants, so their offspring remains attached to the parent plant until they can properly establish themselves. These strategies combined make them able to reproduce at a very rapid rate. Not all impacts associated with Phragmites are negative. Sometimes their presence does not make that large of a difference to an environment. Environments that typically associate Phragmites with negative impacts have seen significant human intervention. In areas that are protected and do not see that human intervention, the competition between the Phragmites and the native plants were minimal, and it heavily reduced those negative impacts associated with the Phragmites. Additionally, a researcher was looking into the competition between the Phragmites australis and the Spartina alterniflora, a native grass to New Jersey wetlands. When they increased the nutrient content in the soil, they found that competition significantly increased, with the Phragmites outcompeting the native Spartina. But in areas without that nutrient addition, the two species were able to coexist, one not outcompeting the other. Many native animal species find Phragmites functionally equivalent to their original native habitats and are not negatively affected. Additionally, there was no significant difference found in ecosystem services between the native Phragmites and the invasive Phragmites. I would also like to note that this is comparing Phragmites to Phragmites, reed to reed, and not, let's say, native invasive Phragmites to any sort of native plant that they outcompeted in an area. I was surprised to find that there were actually some positive impacts associated with the Phragmites, because so often you're told that this species has no redeeming qualities at all. So some native animal species actually prefer the invasive Phragmites. For example, fiddler crabs prefer it over the native Spartina. Fiddler crabs are very important to the ecosystem because they aerate the soil and they provide food to many bird species. They do have some ecosystem services, such as they sequester nutrients, heavy metals, carbons, and due to its strong root structure, it stabilizes the soil. Additionally, it reduces shoreline erosion 82% compared to unvegetated sediments. So the uses for Phragmites. The Native Americans used the native species of Phragmites as culms for arrow shafts, instruments, mats, ceremonial objects, and more. A researcher recently performed a study that found that Phragmites were able to remove different pollutants from wastewater. Also, because they reproduce so rapidly, it has the potential of being a substitute for other building materials that are not as plentiful and do not reproduce as rapidly. It can be used for roof thatching, garden walls, mats, panels, and fences. I work as a naturalist at a state park, and sometimes we host environmental fairs. Um, Typically, I see this one booth giving away Phragmite pens, which I love very much. I think it's really cool that instead of using plastic, they use a native reed. So, how do Phragmites affect the Raritan Basin? As I mentioned earlier, a large issue with Phragmites is that it outcompetes native species. There is no relationship between resources invested in management and management success. So, no matter how much time or money is spent, you are no likelier that the Phragmites will be fully eradicated from an area. During my first year at the state park, when I was just interning, I was shadowing a naturalist on a kayak tour. At the time, I didn't know a lot about native species of New Jersey or Phragmites, and I saw all these reeds that were cut down in the marsh, and I asked the naturalist who I was shadowing what was going on with those. He told me about Phragmites and how it's an invasive species that are highly aggressive and how they were trying to control it without the use of herbicide. I asked him if that worked, and he said it didn't, and they would probably be back in a year. And I remember thinking, what was the point of investing time and money into a seemingly futile task? There was an experiment where researchers were evaluating the success of managing Phragmites. The research team looked at about 200 populations of Phragmites, organizing by size, small, medium, and large. Over the course of 7 years, they used an herbicide, Roundup, which isn't very good for the environment, to try to eradicate the different populations. After those 7 years, they were able to eradicate 84% of the smaller populations, 26% of the medium sized ones, and only 2% of the larger ones. So, eradication is possible, but only with when the population is small and not had a chance to establish itself, and while using this very harsh herbicide. Organizations that endorsed a particular way to manage were not more likely to be successful, whether you used Roundup on a large population or whether you cut them down manually. $4.5 million were spent exclusively on eradicating the Phragmites in 2013. Minimizing nutrient loading in marshes could potentially slow the spread because it minimizes that competition between Phragmites and the native species. So, my conclusions. I believe that prevention is the best way to battle the Phragmites. I think that instead of spending time and money in trying to eradicate an already established large population, that instead those resources should be spent in getting more land under protection and restoring areas in the Raritan Basin because protected reserves provide a strong defense against negative impacts. If necessary, I believe that management should only be done to areas of Phragmites that are small and have not grown to that sort of insurmountable size. Now, my suggestion does not take into account the potential fire hazards that Phragmites possess, and unfortunately, I have no solution in managing those already established larger populations of Phragmites. Thank you.